Walk the World's Rim, and we're on chapter 11, The Deserter. Chaco, I thought never to see you again. Those strangers from the north. From Tribola? Interrupted Chaco. Aunt Maria nodded. The same. They returned this way soon after you left. They made angry talk about hair faces who made slaves of the people. The three senors who were with me last time have stopped that. There is nothing to fear now. The old woman nodded. They were good men. We saw that, but all the same, I feared for you. I thought you would be made a slave, and we would never have you sitting beneath our roof again. Then the Dark One came and said it was true. An angry reply rose to Chaco's lips, but the twinkle in Aunt Maria's eyes stopped it. And what did the Dark One say? He asked instead. He said that you were a slave to your stomach. She clucked and shook her head. But you are so worn and thin, I cannot believe it. Come, you must eat. Ask about Esteban, ordered Fray Marcos. Chaco obeyed. He has gone ahead, said Aunt Maria. Fray Marcos was furious, but Chaco's surge of joy almost drowned his dread of facing Esteban. Surely this meant Esteban was leading the father to Tribola as he'd promised. Not another word until you've eaten. But Aunt Maria's words did not apply to herself. As Chaco and the priest ate, she worked at a new basket and kept up a steady stream of chatter, all of it about Esteban. The charms he made to guard our fields were falling down, so had lost their heads and were blind. Though he was in a great hurry, he took time to restore them for us. Chaco stared out at the fields, each with one of Esteban's ragged scarecrows. That had been a good time. He remembered others. He remembered laughing as Esteban played the man chased by buffalo, racing boats on a flooded river. Even hunting lizards had been an adventure with Esteban. He could remember no time with Esteban that had not been good until Mexico. What had happened to him? Aunt Maria pressed another cactus fruit into his hand, but Chaco chewed it without knowing what he ate. You were like brothers, the woman said. Chaco nodded. He walked the rim of the world together. Now Esteban walked it alone. Perhaps he would have been able to stop if he were gone to the buffalo people, or would they have forgotten? Man chased by buffalo? Perhaps, like the circle of life. Esteban would go around and around with never an end. Hadn't he said it himself? Aunt Maria prodded his sandal. Did you hear me? You said we were like brothers. She looked hurt. That was a long time ago. I am sorry. You should be. It was all about you. The Dark One said you wished to make your home in the land of the hair faces. That is true. She clucked disapprovingly. How can you let your brother walk the long trail alone? But the gray robe and I follow. The Dark One said you wish to travel to Tribola so that you could return to the hair faces as a great warrior and live among them in honor. That is true. Then you do not follow your brother. She said more, but Chaco heard nothing but the thoughts impounding in his own head. Esteban had lied. He'd broken his promise. He said he would lead them, but he lied. Chaco jerked his head to clear it. After all, Esteban was only a slave. What honor had a slave? Yet, with all his doubts, Chaco would sooner have expected the sun to travel south to north than for Esteban to break his word. Slave or free, Esteban was still Esteban. Chaco held his breath so that the thought would not escape. what had really hurt him that day in the stable yard. Was it the knowledge that Esteban was a slave, or the fear that he had lied? If it was because Esteban was a slave, was that only because Chaco had thought all slaves were cowards with no honor? For that would mean Esteban was not worthy of the love and friendship Chaco had given. Then he had learned Esteban's story of being sold into slavery, and he'd known the man who was no coward defeated in battle. Once more he had placed his trust in Esteban, but not as fully as before. Anger and suspicion had remained. Why? Because he could no longer hold fast to what he'd been taught about slaves. For no longer could he believe that all slaves were cowards with no sense of honor. Esteban proved it was false. His courage was even greater than Durante's. As for honor, what had Esteban said? A slave can find honor in serving his master, because he had gone willingly into slavery to save his family. Esteban had served his master well. Chaco squirmed uneasily. He saw now the reason he could not admit he'd been wrong about slaves. For if that was false, it meant that Esteban was right about the Spanish God and the spirit of misfortune being one and the same. It meant Esteban was right about other things too painful for Chaco to think of. I am not a slave to my stomach, thought Chaco angrily. I have not deserted my mission. I wish to remain in Mexico only because the Spanish have much to teach me. But suppose Esteban was right. No, he couldn't be. Chaco groped desperately for an excuse not to admit it even to himself. He found one. Hadn't Aunt Maria just said they walked different trails? That could only mean that Esteban now traveled northeast along the river to the land of the buffalo hunters. Esteban had broken his word, and the thought soothed his own feelings of guilt. Aunt Maria said softly, "The Dark One wished to say farewell to his brother." Then, why did he not wait? He said you no longer wished to share his campfire. Chaco hung his head, and as he remembered their last quarrel, he had learned much since then. If only he could let Esteban know. But Esteban was gone, and there had been no one to wish him to go with God. If only I could have seen him once more. Then follow him, said Aunt Maria. I cannot. I must go to Cibola. Cibola is made of stone. It will always be there. But what of the Dark One? Mexico had been lonely enough this past winter, but at least he'd had the faint hope of finding Esteban. He remembered what it had been like when he'd decided Esteban was dead, when he'd thought never again to see that dark head tilt back to let the laughter roll free. Now it was even worse, for Esteban was gone with the memory of their last quarrel hanging between them. Never could Chaco erase it. Never could he let Esteban know how wrong he'd been. Chaco gazed to the northeast. What if Esteban wasn't guiding them to Cibola as he'd promised? The slave wanted nothing but his freedom, just as Chaco wanted nothing but to return to Mexico. It was the only chance Esteban would have, just as going to Cibola was Chaco's only hope of good life in Mexico. How then could he blame Esteban? In the long silence, Fray Marcos again complained of Esteban's disobedience to his orders to wait. I know you relayed my message, my son, but since Esteban has chosen to disobey, how shall we find the trail to Cibola? You do not know the country beyond. Aunt Maria, I know that your husband is no longer young, but would he guide the gray robe to Cibola? My husband is with the Dark One. Chaco's first feeling was one of joy. Esteban wanted so much to see him that he'd taken Aunt Maria's husband with him, knowing Chaco would have to follow. There was no way they would reach Cibola unless he brought Aunt Maria's husband back. Esteban would be camped a few days beyond, waiting for him. Then doubt and anger swept over him. Esteban could be using Aunt Maria's husband as he'd used the huge crosses with Fray Marcos. This could be a lure to get Chaco to follow, never quite catching up, until he'd drawn the boy all the way to the Buffalo people. Then there'd be nothing for Chaco to do but return home. Esteban had never wanted Chaco to remain in Mexico, but only because he cared for me, Chaco whispered. Chaco had planned to send Fray Marcos with Aunt Maria's husband, while he trailed Esteban and shared one last campfire with his friend. He had wanted them to part with memories they could smile upon. Now he would trail Esteban for another reason. He must bring Aunt Maria's husband back to guide them. He rose and glanced at the sun. I must go now and find the Dark One quickly. Aunt Maria pushed herself to her feet. I will call my brothers to guide you. I can find the way. He could find his way to the river. From there, it was a long but easy trail to the buffalo country. You will need someone to help carry water. It is a long, dry trail. Chaco nodded. Perhaps the river was dry at this season. He would trust Aunt Maria to know best. He turned to Fray Marcos. I am going after Esteban. Tell him that we must wait for him. Is there someone here who could guide me to the next village or two? You will have to wait here until I return. No, we have wasted too much time already. He dared not tell Fray Marcos that Esteban was no longer on the trail to Cibola. Not until Esteban was safe in the land beyond the mountains. In desperation, he turned to Aunt Maria. Is there no one else in the village who knows the trail to Cibola? She laughed. So many have used it recently that even a small child could follow it. I will send the gray robe on tomorrow. Do not worry. You will meet him later. Now hurry. Remember that my home will be empty until you return. Go with God, Fray Marcos blessed him. Though bewildered, Chaco had no choice but to follow Aunt Maria's two brothers out of the village. They traveled with warriors, resting only briefly during the night and eating on the walk. The water gourds were used sparingly. Chaco could not understand how the men could travel on so little water. He dreaded the thought of what the hot afternoon would be like. Tired, hungry, and dry of mouth, Chaco trotted with head bent, following the pair of sandals ahead of him. The day was more than half gone before he realized his shadow was so far to his right that he had to turn his head to see it. He raised his head and squinted at the mountains. They should be traveling a little to the east, but they weren't. They were going directly north. He forced himself ahead to ask the Pima, "Where are we going?" "To meet the Dark One." The man stared at him so strangely that Chaco dropped back in line and asked no more questions. The next day they reached water and a village. The dry time was over, but it brought little relief to Chaco. Though they passed many villages, they did not stop. Then, on the third day, they saw Esteban's dust in the valley head. At every village, men had joined Esteban. Nearly 100 now followed his prancing feet and swishing gourd rattle. The Dark One has strong medicine, said one of Chaco's guides. Let us hurry. Chaco wondered if Esteban planned to take these Pima all the way to the buffalo people? And why had he not taken the trail they'd traveled before? By tonight, he'd know the answers to all his questions. According to his guides, they would overtake Esteban at the next village soon after dark. Chaco spent the time planning what he would say. He would walk right up and say, "I have come for Aunt Maria's husband." No, that would not do. It sounded like a Spanish soldier. Better to say, "I understand why you have deserted us, and I hold no anger." Chaco shook his head. That sounded like Fray Marcos. Perhaps he should apologize for that last one and then demand Aunt Maria's husband. He practiced other phrases, but when he finally walked up to the cook fire and looked across at his friend's face, all he said was, "How goes it, Esteban?" The familiar grin ceased the dark face. It goes well, little one. Have some venison." Chaco dropped to the ground and accepted the food eagerly. It was as if the months in Mexico and since had never been. Then Aunt Maria's husband walked through the edge of the firelight, and Chaco remembered why he was here. "Esteban, I know you are going to the buffalo people." The dark head nodded. "I have not told Fray Marcos. I was afraid he would follow and order you to return." Though now that Esteban had broken his word, Chaco didn't know if any order from his master would have any effect on the slave's desertion. "1,000 thanks, little one, but I must have Aunt Maria's husband to guide us to Cibola." Chaco fidgeted through the long silence that followed. Was Esteban going to refuse? Would he carry Chaco off to the buffalo people? "Esteban," he said at last, "I must guide Fray Marcos to Cibola. If I don't, I cannot return to Mexico." "And what will you do in Mexico, little one?" Chaco stared at him, hoping there would not be any other quarrel. "Can you bear arms in the service of the king?" asked Esteban. "Or do you have a trade to serve those who do bear arms? You must have something that the Spaniards want to be welcome." "You are throwing my words back at me." He groped for a way to strike back. "Perhaps the gift of laughter will no longer be enough for the buffalo people to welcome you. It will be enough until I learn their ways. I can learn a trade or something. To be sure, little one, but you learn slowly. I would not want you to be a beggar in the plaza." Chaco winced at the memory those words brought. When he lifted his head proudly and looked unwaveringly into Esteban's eyes, it needed all his courage, but he would say it. A beggar lives on the hunting of others, like a buzzard or a maggot. I would rather be a slave than a beggar. At least a slave can keep his honor." Esteban smiled, his eyes blinking rapidly. "To be sure, little one." Then he laughed and sent Chaco sprawling with a playful blow on the back. "There was hope for you yet. Here, little one, keep these for a time of great need." Once again, the 2 blue stones lay in Chaco's hand. They would mean great wealth for Esteban in the buffalo country, yet he'd given them to Chaco. "I can think of no need great enough for me to part with them. 1,000 thanks, Esteban." Esteban rubbed his nose briskly with the back of his hand and coughed. "Now rest, little one. We leave before dawn." "But I am going to Cibola." "To be sure. We are all going to Cibola." "But you said you were returning to the buffalo people." "I also said I would lead Fray Marcos to Cibola. Surely you did not think I would break up my promise." Chaco hung his head. "I want only to stay far enough ahead of Fray Marcos that his voice cannot reach me. We will find a welcome in every village. I shall tell the people of Cibola that he is a great medicine man and comes in peace. When I am sure he will be welcome there, I shall go east to the buffalo country. But if Aunt Maria's husband stays with you, who will guide Fray Marcos? Esteban waved his hand at the many followers about the fires. An expedition such as this leaves a well-marked trail, even beyond the villages. Aunt Maria had said that even a child could follow. She'd known where Esteban was going. Why hadn't she told him? He thought back over the words. She had never said Esteban was not going to Cibola. Truly, what people did not say was more important than what they spoke. It was clear from what Aunt Maria did say that Esteban wished to see him. If I had known he was going to Cibola, thought Chaco, I wonder if I would have come. Probably not. Shameful memories would have kept him lagging in the rear, convinced there was plenty of time to make amends at Cibola. It needed the shock of Aunt Maria's words to bring him to this campfire. Chaco grinned. Esteban had not been sure words would be enough. He had let Chaco believe he was taking Aunt Maria's husband to the buffalo country. Chaco could imagine the two of them plotting, planning what to say and what to leave unsaid. They had not known that Chaco had already discovered that Esteban was still Esteban, even if he did bend his honor to suit himself. But perhaps everyone did. Hadn't Dorantes and Cabeza de Vaca forgotten Esteban when it suited them too? Perhaps Chaco was doing it himself when he denied it was Brother Solano's kitchen that drew him back to Mexico. Certainly he had bent his honor when he told Fray Marcos only half the reason he was going to find Esteban. One could not live without bending one's honor at some time. But like a bent bow, honor would spring back. The important thing was not to break it, as Dorantes had. He yawned and wondered if Fray Marcos ever bent his honor. Chaco doubted it. Perhaps that was what made Fray Marcos a priest. The thought reminded him to warn Esteban. Fray Marcos is not far behind. He is very angry that you have not waited for him. I will send him another cross tomorrow. That will keep him in good humor. That will only make him angrier. Then I shall not send it. Esteban stretched out with his feet from the dying fire. Chaco lay down beside him. Tell me how you came to my country. Not now, little one. It has been a long time, Esteban. With a soft chuckle, Esteban began to tell of the ships leaving Cuba. Chaco forced himself to stay awake to the end. Tomorrow night you will do the man chased by buffalo? To be sure. Strange it is it not? Most of all, I wanted to see a great ship and a bullfight in Mexico. I have seen neither. Are you not likely to see the ship there, little one? Nor a bullfight either, thought Chaco, for he could not bear to go without Esteban. The next night, they had no time for things of the past. At sunset, they stood on a hillside and stared across the desert at the red mesa. Atop it rose the walls of Cibola, pink in the setting sun. Tomorrow they would enter the city of gold, turquoise and emeralds. Chaco could think of nothing but the future, and from the way that Esteban's eyes stared toward the buffalo country, neither could he.